Aurora, Colorado. I am going to be attending as a senior at Regis Jesuit High School, and I am 17 years old.
Hi, I'm Nidhi Pandya. I'm 17 years old. I'm from Austin, Texas, and this year I'll be a senior at Vandergrift High School.
I'm Abby Criswell, and I live right here in Austin. I am currently 15 years old, and next year I will be a junior at Westlake High School.
I'm Henry Meyerson. I am from Seattle, Washington, and I'm 16 years old. Next year I will be a junior at Raisbeck Aviation High School.
So before we start, we just want to thank some of our mentors that have helped us throughout this process.
So Himanshu is our scientist, and he gave us all of the data that we needed to start this project. And he gave us structure as to where we were going to go, what our expectations were, and what our goals were supposed to be. And he also gave us enough free rein to really decide what we wanted to do with this. So it kind of gave us a realistic feeling of we are the scientists and we get to choose what we want to do with the data provided to us.
I have to give a shout out to Rachna. She later in the later stages of our project, we had to put our data into graphics, and I had never used the MATLAB application before, and I already had to learn Python and shell coding, so I was already struggling with programming languages, and then I also had to learn MATLAB, and Rachna came in and she knew all the tricks because she uses it in her job, and she really helped us make our graphics look even more awesome. So thank you.
And finally, just need to give a huge shout out to Ben. He was with us every step of the way. He helped us through brainstorming. He helped us learn all the programming that we needed, shell scripting, everything that we did. Ben was there, Ben helped out, and we couldn't have done any of this without him. So thank you.
And now into GRACE. So GRACE began its operations in 2002, and it was designed to only last for 5 years. But it's lasted for over 14 years now, and it still continues to send us data every 5 seconds about Earth's gravitational field.
So the way that it measures Earth's gravitational field is GRACE is a pair of 2 satellites that orbit the Earth in a polar orbit. And it's equipped with a K-band antenna that constantly measures the distance between the 2 satellites. And so as the first satellite passes over an area with a larger mass, it speeds up, therefore increasing the space between the 2 satellites. So this way we can measure the Earth's atmosphere, the topography, and the gravitational field.
For our first task, as part of the GRACE team, we had to study the GRACE satellite ground track data. The data we received for this goal was ranged from 2002 to 2014, which ended up encompassing over 378 million data points. So it was a lot of data we had to sort through. To deal with this big data concept, we decided to design an algorithm that would divide the Earth into 3-degree latitude by 3-degree longitude bins and count for each individual bin the number of times the GRACE satellite flew over and collected data from that region. This kind of format let us see and observe variations in GRACE's data sampling across the entire life of the GRACE mission.
So before we started our project, we had to ask our mentors really what we were doing, because we got our project over the summer and we had no idea what it meant. And so we further understood the problem, and then we began planning at a whiteboard multiple approaches, and we came up with 2 solid approaches. So one was easier. You would look at just data from one of the 3x3 areas, and then one was harder and more versatile, where we would look at data from the entire Earth. So of course we went with the harder, more versatile approach. And then the second problem we ran into was that all of us came from different programming backgrounds. We didn't all know the same languages. So we had to come to a consensus on what programming language we would use. So we consulted our mentors and picked Python because it is the most versatile and the best for math.
So what happened next is we took a look at the data that we'd received. And so what it was data files broken down, one single data file for each day, for a total of about 4,400 data files. Now that's a lot of data to sort through, and you don't want to go through each file individually. So the first thing that we did is we concatenated the data files for each month into monthly data files using some shell scripting and some bash files. And so after that, we were able to write code to convert the data files that we had, the monthly data file to the longitude and latitude ground tracks of GRACE, into a matrix that displayed the frequency in which GRACE passes over each of these 3x3 bins. And so by the end, we had matrices for every single month that GRACE has been operational, and matrices for every day, and one for the entire overall length of the GRACE mission.
Now that we had our matrices of our frequency data, we had to take that data and visualize it. And so like the data that we received was GRACE's ground tracks, which is shown here. And this really gives you a good visual of what like the regions GRACE would cover and collect data from in a single day. But there, in the polar regions, you start getting this overlap. So it's really hard to distinguish how many times GRACE visited this one region because it's crossed over there too many times and the ground tracks overlap. So after we analyzed our data and put it into these matrices, we used the MATLAB application and made a heat map. And you can see how it correlates to the ground track data into the heat map. The darker blue shows the regions that were less frequently visited by GRACE and less data was sampled from these regions. And the areas with yellow and green were visited more frequently and more data was collected.
So this video is the result of all of our hard work for the past 2 weeks, and as the title says, this is 12 years of data in only 32 seconds. And what we did with all of this data is we received it all 12 for 5 seconds of that entire 12 years. And we decided to split it all up into months. So you can see the months passing up here in the corner. And it just shows how GRACE is covering all of the areas of the Earth. And you can see a little bit of fluctuations like there in the blue especially, and that could be because either there are fewer days in that month or there are just missing data points that we did not receive. But the general trend that you can see is that because of the polar orbit of GRACE, it's able to cover the entire Earth evenly with the exception of the poles, because naturally with a polar orbit you're going to visit the poles much more frequently. And I should also mention that this is on a scale of only up to 20 visits, but there are some points that are visited more than that, but because they're such huge outliers and there are very few of those, we decided to just cap it at 20, because if we didn't, it would just change the colors and it would be harder to see where all the detail is.
All right, so that leads us to the big question of so what? Why do we care what the ground tracks of GRACE look like? Why do we care how often it passes over certain points? And so that really kind of leads us into the second part of the project which we worked on, which was sampling. And so what we need to do is, in essence, GRACE is a giant science experiment. It's a really cool one up in space, orbiting the Earth. But in its very essence, it's a science experiment. And science experiments serve to validate and confirm hypotheses that people have written, or in this case, models that people have written. And so our big question with the ground tracks is, does GRACE sample frequently enough in order to be able to validate some of these models and hypotheses that scientists have put forth about the way the world works? And so in order to kind of illustrate this and show how well GRACE can validate, or how well GRACE can sample these different data sets, we are going to take a look at a couple examples. One for atmospheric variability and one for hydrological variability. So in order to do this, we're going to start by looking at one specific area on the map, and that would be the Victoria River Basin. So here is a graph of hydrological variability, or yes, hydrological variability data. And so if you notice, this is over the course of an entire year, in this case 2008. And so if you notice, it's actually a fairly slow process with just some big curves going on up and down. Whereas atmospheric variability, which we'll take a look at in a minute, is a much quicker process. And so what we can do is we can overlay this graph with all of the times that GRACE flies over each of these, all the times that GRACE samples this area, the Victoria River Basin. And we can see that it seems to very accurately be putting points on all of the major instances of this graph because it's a very slow, gradual change. So GRACE actually managed to pretty accurately represent then how this model works. However,
Yes, on the entirely opposite side, here you have a model of the atmospheric variability in the Victoria River Basin, and you can already see that this is an entirely different type of data set. Unlike hydrological variability, atmospheric variability changes very rapidly, and there's very short-term trends that are that occur really fast over this year span. So when you overlay the GRACE data and you see the times that GRACE could collect data in this region, GRACE would miss a lot of these key peaks and valleys in the data. And it's and atmospheric variability just changes too quickly for GRACE to be able to study that natural process. So this is an example when GRACE could not be used to study that.
So missing all of these points is a little bit of a restriction, and how would we try to get more frequent sampling then? So you might be able to change the orbit, but GRACE is already in a polar orbit, so by being in that, it's already at its maximum view of the Earth, as opposed in comparison to other orbital patterns. So another solution could possibly be having a constellation of GRACE satellites, where instead of just one pair going around the Earth, you have many that can look at all sides of the Earth. Because if you only have one pair, they look at just one point at one time, and they're not going to come back to that point for days at a time, possibly. And so within those days that it's not seeing anything, atmospheric variability could fluctuate incredibly, and you don't see any of that until it comes back again, and you just missed everything in between. So if we have more satellites coming over all of these areas again, we can catch more of that variation and fluctuation.
So throughout this process, we did run into a few problems. The first one being, like I mentioned before, we all came from different programming backgrounds, and so coming to a consensus on one programming language was really hard. And then after that, we all had to learn that programming language. And throughout the 2 weeks, we actually learned over 5 programming languages, so that was pretty cool.
Definitely another big stumbling block for us, and I think many people here can sympathize, was sleep deprivation. When we got this project, we were really excited about it, and we were super fired up, and so that meant that oftentimes we stayed up really late working on it because it was just so cool, and we were having so much fun working on it. And so towards the kind of end of the later weeks, it started to feel it in some of the lectures and stuff. And so definitely working while being a little bit tired and learning maybe now is when we go to bed and I can't keep staying up was definitely something that came out of this.
Also, I feel like the team really bonded well, but we also had our moments, definitely. We had a lot of different strengths and areas of weakness, and we all had our own view of how to do the project, and not even the whole project, but each individual step of the project. So we really had to reconcile everyone's view to come out with what would be best for our goal, which I think we did pretty well.
So we had many new experiences on this project. When we first got this data file and just ran some basic math to figure out how many data points are there, when we realized the number is in the hundreds of millions, my first instinct was, we need a supercomputer. There's no way we're ever going to possibly be able to sift through this much data and turn it into anything usable, because that's a massive amount of data. So my first instinct was, let's go talk to Ben, see if he can get a supercomputer time or something so that we can figure out how to do this. But then through just talking with our mentors and stuff, we realized, no, you don't really need a supercomputer to handle even these massive amounts of data. And so that was one of the really cool experiences that we got out of this, was learning how to work with large amounts of data and not being just overwhelmed by it.
Another great thing about this experience was not only working with Ben and Rachna and Mr. Nachi, but also interacting with the other scientists in the SEAS program and also the other scientists at JSC when we visited, and just the wide variety of fields that we were exposed to. And that was just, it kind of made entering the science field and eventually getting a job as a scientist seem more attainable and like more like a realistic goal.
Yeah, and I have taken many computer science courses, so like programming, I've done that before, but this was just completely different. You could see your work actually doing something, and we got to work with actual GRACE data, which is really cool to me.
So one of the suggestions that we had was possibly before we arrived is having a little bit more specific instructions for our project specifically, because before, like we said, there were so many languages we had before, and it was kind of hard. It was kind of nice in a way that we all knew different languages so we can teach each other, but it would have been nice to have known one language that we could have all worked with.
Also, I really liked in this program the activities that were outside of our GRACE mission and really getting to bond with the other interns. One of the ones we really liked as a team was the Challenger activity, Hurricane Preparedness. It was like super time deadline, and we were like under like real-time stress, and that really helped us like pull together as a team and like know how to like separate tasks and like divide and conquer, really. So we talked with Miss Nab a little bit about this earlier, but having another Challenger activity that was more related to space exploration, like such as like a mission to the moon where we had to like save astronauts or something, where we had to work as a team, I thought another one of those would really contribute to the program.
And so overall, coming into this, we were really interested in the space industry. So it's hard to say it's life-changing. Now I want to work in the space industry, even though we already have. But I can definitely say we all want to work in it even more. After getting just a little taste of what it's like, we're really realizing, wow, this is incredibly awesome. This is something that I want to continue doing for a long time to come. And so, yes.
Okay, so to wrap it up, we're going to talk about some of our favorite activities outside of our project.
I know that actually I had a lot of favorite activities, so I guess it's not really favorite, it's just everything was great. But I liked going to mission control, especially seeing the original Apollo mission control room and being able to go in and play with all the consoles. And it, like being in there, just kind of messing with all the buttons and sitting in the chairs with my friends, it kind of almost felt, I mean, even though we were just playing, it felt almost like we were watching a mission because the screens were lit up, except for on the consoles, but I could like picture the TVs being on and like seeing instructions going over them and pushing buttons and being like, I'm trying to help someone get to the moon right now. So doing that felt like I was really doing something for NASA or for space research. And then later going to see the Saturn V rocket, that was the first time I saw anything like that. So it was kind of like seeing all the emotions that I had that entire day just like blow up into the rocket itself. And I remember sitting outside in the bus too and looking at the building it was in and thinking there's probably like 5 rockets in there, right? And then going in and realizing it was only one giant rocket, and I was like, that's kind of my emotions inside of that rocket right now.
I'm kind of with Marlene. Everything, like this whole program was really awesome, and I had a wonderful time. I learned so much, and really working with this peer group, all the other interns, like I can't stress this enough. Like it was just so different to work with people who wanted it, or like wanted to like get to like reach our goal or like discover new scientific like properties as much as I wanted to, and that was really cool. It was like a different level of program. I think one of the moments that I loved the most was the neutral buoyancy laboratory. It was really cool seeing the divers and the scientists and the astronauts like training in real time and knowing that these people were working towards like ongoing missions in NASA. I just like the realistic applications of that was really cool.
And so I'm going to have to go with Abby as well. I really agree that just seeing all these things in person really was what made all the difference for me. I'm someone who I've always kind of loved space, and so I've read a lot about these things, and then you actually go to Johnson Space Center and you go here and you actually see the satellites and you see the data and you realize this is something real and people are working on this all the time. And that was just incredibly cool for me, most especially the robotics lab at Johnson Space Center, where they let us sit in the rovers and touch all their robots, and totally happy to ask questions. I thought that was just an incredibly cool experience on the whole.
Yeah, I would say my favorite was Johnson Space Center as well, and the part I loved was going to the International Space Station Mission Control and like seeing on the screen like people in space, like working with tools and stuff. It was just so cool, and it was like live, and I just thought it was amazing. They were actually there. And just to wrap it up, we want to say thank you to a lot of people who helped us get this opportunity. NASA, Texas Space Grant Consortium, sorry. UT Austin, the C staff, especially Mrs. Baggio, Ms. Knapp, Ms. Ramirez, and Mr. Johnson, just for everything. We really, really appreciate this opportunity, and we had a ton of fun. So thank you.
Questions? You can't have answered all your questions.
Oh. Thank you.
Great team, yeah. So how many constellations do you think, Greg, how many individual missions do you think you need to accomplish the goal of matching constellations?
Well, I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think that would depend on how many data samples you would like and what kind of research you would like to use it for. So, I mean, if you want to have hydrological variability, it's already pretty good as it is. But if you want to measure atmospheric variability, you're going to have a lot. I don't know how many, but a lot.
Yeah, we that was kind of like the next stage of our like mission, if we had enough time, was to like explore like how a constellation would improve the GRACE mission overall, like, and see if that could apply to further missions. And also like the AOD, the atmospheric variability, was kind of given as an example that would have been like out of GRACE's reach. So that's kind of like a specific example that would be extremely hard for GRACE to be able to study. So that one would probably require a lot more satellites than other types of data that we study.
Yes?
Can you give an example of what the physical phenomena is that causes that hydrologic or atmospheric variability? What's going on?
So the hydrologic variability, so we weren't going into specific GRACE mission data about hydrologic variability. We're just talking about and showing that it can change easily, or it can be sampled easily by GRACE. And so what hydrologic variability is just kind of the movement of water through the ecosystem, or just through the entire globe, honestly. And so it's like rainfall, and like rain's going to fall at a constant rate, water's going to evaporate at a constant rate, plants are going to absorb that water, and everything, it's just that whole cycle. And that's just a much slower process, and since it moves at a constant rate and it's a little bit slower, it's much easier for GRACE to pick up on just with the sample rate that it's at right now. Does that kind of make sense?
All right, simple question for you. How far apart are the two satellites and how accurately do they measure their distance?
It's 220 kilometers and within 1/100th of the width of a hair.
Yes.
They're very precise.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much
Thank
for your time.
you.
Thank you.